On a cold Saturday morning in November, three military vehicles rolled into the parking lot of an abandoned hardware store on the east side of Millbrook, Ohio. Soldiers in dress uniforms stepped out onto the wet asphalt. A two-star general straightened his jacket and walked toward a row of worn tents where the town's homeless residents were just waking up. Across the street, people came out of the diner still holding their coffee cups because nothing like this had ever happened in Millbrook. The soldiers were looking for a 74-year-old man named Raymond Carter, a man who owned nothing but a sleeping bag, a backpack, and an old army jacket with the name tape torn off. And the reason they came for him had started just the evening before, with one hot meal, a bench in the rain, and an old widow who could not stop crying. Millbrook, Ohio, one day earlier. If you had asked anyone in town about the quiet man who collected cans along Route 9, they would have told you his name was Ray, and not much else. Ray never asked anyone for money. He never stood at intersections with a cardboard sign. Every morning he walked the shoulder of the highway with a garbage bag over his shoulder, picking up aluminum cans, and every afternoon he carried them to the recycling center behind the grocery store, where the machine counted them out in nickels and dimes. On a good week, it added up to about $11, and Ray had a ritual with those $11. Every Friday evening, he walked into Rosie's Diner on Main Street, sat at the last stool at the counter, and ordered the meatloaf special. Mashed potatoes, green beans, a roll with butter, and a slice of pie if the week had been generous. One hot meal a week. That was the entire luxury of Raymond Carter's life, and he never missed it. The waitress, a young woman named Dana, always kept that last stool open on Fridays. She noticed things about Ray that other people didn't. She noticed that he always said thank you twice. She noticed that his hands shook a little when it got cold. And she noticed that no matter how hungry he was, he ate slowly, carefully, like a man who had learned a long time ago that a hot meal was something sacred. What Dana didn't know, what nobody in Millbrook knew, was where Ray had learned that. Because 53 years earlier, Raymond Carter had been a 21-year-old corporal in the jungles of Vietnam, and he had gone 11 days without a hot meal while carrying something through that jungle that he had never once spoken about since. Not to doctors, not to shelters, not even to the VA counselor who asked him twice a year if he wanted to talk. There was a reason the name tape on his army jacket was torn off. Ray had removed it himself, decades ago, because he didn't feel he deserved to wear it. But this story isn't about the war, not yet. This story is about that Friday evening and the rain. It started coming down hard around 6 o'clock, the kind of cold November rain that soaks through everything. Ray had just picked up his meatloaf special, box to go this time, because the diner was crowded and he didn't want to take up a stool on a busy night. He had $4 left in his pocket. He tucked the warm styrofoam box inside his jacket to keep it from the rain and started walking toward the underpass where he slept when the weather turned. He didn't notice that Dana had grabbed the dinner roll he'd left behind on the counter and hurried out after him to catch him before he got far. That's when he saw her. An elderly woman, small and thin, sitting alone on the bench at the bus stop on Chestnut Avenue. No umbrella, a thin gray coat soaked through at the shoulders. She was clutching a purse in her lap with both hands, and she was shivering. Ray slowed down. Everyone else had walked right past her that evening, but Ray stopped, because he could see something that the others hadn't bothered to see. The woman was crying. He stood a few feet away, careful not to frighten her, and asked if she was all right. The woman looked up, and it took her a moment to focus on him. She told him her name was Eleanor. She had taken the bus out to Fairview Cemetery that afternoon, the way she did every year on this date, and she had stayed too long at the grave. She'd missed the 5:30 bus. The next one wasn't coming for another hour, and she admitted, in a small, embarrassed voice, that she hadn't eaten since breakfast. Her hands were trembling. Whether it was from the cold or from low blood sugar, Ray couldn't tell. But he had seen men tremble like that before, and he knew it wasn't good. Ray didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh it. He didn't think about the $11 and the 7 days until the next hot meal. He simply sat down on the wet bench beside her, opened his jacket, and held out the warm styrofoam box. Eleanor refused, of course. She could see what he was. The worn boots, the frayed backpack, the beard flecked with gray. She told him she couldn't possibly take food from him. And Ray said the words that Dana at the diner would later repeat to a local newspaper, because she had caught up to him at the corner, roll in hand, and stood a few steps away under the awning of the shop beside the bus stop, watching the whole thing. Ray pressed the box gently into Eleanor's hands and said, "Ma'am, I've been hungry before. It doesn't scare me anymore. But I'm not going to sit here and watch it happen to you." Eleanor ate the meatloaf at that bus stop in the rain while a homeless man sat beside her and made sure she was warm, giving her his dry scarf, positioning himself on the side the wind was coming from. And as she ate, she began to talk, the way lonely people do when someone finally listens. She told him this date was the anniversary. 53 years ago, her husband Daniel had been killed overseas. She had been 26 years old, with a 6-year-old son, and a folded flag, and a coffin she was never allowed to open. Ray went very still. Eleanor kept talking. She said her husband had been a captain in the army. She said the thing she had never made peace with, in all these decades, was not the death itself. It was that Daniel had died somewhere far away, in the mud, in the dark, and she had spent 53 years tortured by one question. Was he alone at the end? Did her husband die alone? And that is the moment this story turns. Because Eleanor, glancing over to thank the stranger again, noticed his forearm. Ray's sleeve had ridden up when he passed her the box. On his weathered skin was a faded tattoo, more than half a century old. A black and gold shield with a horse's head. The insignia of the 1st Cavalry Division. Her husband's division. Eleanor's voice changed. She asked him quietly if he had served. Ray nodded once, the way he always did, hoping the conversation would move on. It didn't. She asked when. He told her. She asked where. And when Ray said the name of the province, Eleanor's fork stopped halfway to her mouth because it was the same province printed on the telegram she had kept in a shoebox since 1971. Then she asked the question she had no logical reason to ask, except that something in her chest was pounding and would not let her stay silent. She asked him his unit. "Charlie Company," Ray said. Eleanor set the box down on the bench. Charlie Company. Her Daniel's company. She turned to face this homeless stranger fully now, rain running down both their faces, and she told him her husband's name, Captain Daniel Whitmore. For a long moment, Ray didn't move at all. Dana, watching from a few steps away, said later that she thought the old man had stopped breathing. Then Raymond Carter, who had not spoken of the war in 53 years, looked at this widow he had met 20 minutes earlier, and his eyes filled with tears, and he said 7 words. He wasn't alone. He was never alone. Now, Eleanor had heard comforting words from strangers before, soldiers, chaplains, well-meaning men at reunions who told her generic kindnesses. But Ray didn't stop there. His voice shaking, he said, "He asked for you at the end, ma'am. He asked me to tell Ellie the sunflowers came up." And Eleanor Whitmore began to sob on that bench, because no one on this earth could have known that. In the spring of 1971, in her last letter to Vietnam, she had written her husband one small piece of news from home. The sunflower seeds their little boy Thomas had planted along the back fence had finally come up. Daniel had written back that it was his favorite letter of the whole war. That letter had arrived in Millbrook 2 days after the telegram. She had never told a soul what was in it. The only living person who could know about those sunflowers was someone who had been beside Captain Daniel Whitmore in his final moments. If this story is hitting you the way it hit everyone in Millbrook, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one deserve to be told. Now back to that bench on Chestnut Avenue, because Eleanor was about to ask the question that would bring the army to town. Through her tears, Eleanor gripped Ray's hand and asked him who he was. And here is where Raymond Carter did the thing that tells you everything about the man. He gently pulled his hand back, stood up, and said he was nobody, ma'am, just glad she got a warm meal. Then he flagged down the taxi idling outside the diner, put his last $4 into the driver's hand, helped Eleanor into the back seat so she wouldn't have to wait an hour in the rain, and told the driver her address after she gave it. Eleanor was still calling questions to him through the window as the cab pulled away. Ray just raised one hand, turned up his collar, and walked off into the rain toward the underpass, with no meal, no money, and no idea what he had just set in motion. Because Eleanor Whitmore did not sleep that night. The moment she got home, she picked up the telephone and called her son. Thomas Whitmore was 6 years old when his father's coffin came home. He grew up with a folded flag on the mantel and a hole in the middle of his life, and he dealt with it the only way that made sense to him. He followed his father into the Army, and over a 35-year career, Thomas Whitmore rose all the way to Major General, 2 stars on his shoulder, currently serving at a base about 4 hours from Millbrook. But there was one file he had carried with him through every posting, every promotion, every decade. The incident report from November 1971. The official record said this: Charlie Company was ambushed at night in bad terrain. Captain Daniel Whitmore was fatally wounded covering his men's withdrawal. And then the record said something that had haunted Thomas his entire life. One corporal refused evacuation, stayed behind under fire, and carried the captain's body through enemy territory for 2 days and 2 nights, alone, without food, through the monsoon until he reached the American lines. Because of that corporal, Daniel Whitmore came home. Because of that corporal, there was a grave at Fairview Cemetery for Eleanor to visit every year, instead of a name on a wall of the missing. A lieutenant had recommended that corporal for the Silver Star. 3 weeks later, that lieutenant was killed in action, the paperwork died with him, the company was scattered and rotated home, and the medevac records from that chaotic week were incomplete. The Army knew what had been done. The Army never confirmed who had done it. The men of Charlie Company only ever called him the corporal, who wouldn't put the captain down. Thomas had spent 40 years, on and off, pulling threads on that file. Every thread had ended nowhere, until 11:40 at night on a rainy Friday, when his 80-year-old mother called him, crying so hard he could barely understand her, saying, "Sunflowers, Thomas." He knew about the sunflowers. Thomas Whitmore did not sleep that night either. He had his mother describe everything: the tattoo, the province, Charlie Company, a first name, Ray, that Dana the waitress confirmed when Eleanor called the diner the moment it opened. By 4 in the morning, Thomas was on the phone with an Army Records Center, and by sunrise, a personnel file from 1971 was open on his screen. Corporal Raymond J. Carter, Charlie Company, 1st Cavalry Division. Honorably discharged 1972. Treated for malnutrition and severe trench foot after an unexplained 2-day absence in enemy territory in November 1971, the exact dates of the ambush. And there, in the file of a man who had slipped through every crack the system had, Thomas found the last known address. A homeless services center, Millbrook, Ohio, his mother's own town. The soldier his family had been searching for since 1971 had been sleeping under a bridge 20 minutes from Eleanor's front door. Thomas made 3 phone calls before dawn, one to his commanding officer to explain why he needed emergency personal leave and an honor detail, one to the awards branch to reopen a Silver Star recommendation that had been sitting in limbo for 53 years, now supported by a general officer and a living witness statement, and one to his mother to tell her to put on her Sunday dress because they were going to go find the corporal who carried Dad home. Which brings us back to that cold Saturday morning and the 3 military vehicles rolling into the parking lot of the abandoned hardware store. Ray was sitting on an overturned milk crate, warming his hands over a small camp stove, when the convoy stopped 30 feet away. His first instinct, the instinct of a man who had been moved along by authorities his whole life, was that they had come to clear the encampment. He started gathering his things. Then the rear door of the middle vehicle opened, and a 2-star general stepped out into the gray morning light, followed by a small elderly woman in her Sunday dress. And Ray froze, because he recognized her. It was the widow from the bus stop. Major General Thomas Whitmore walked across that parking lot, past the tents, past the shopping carts, while the whole town watched from the diner windows. He stopped in front of a homeless man in a torn jacket, a man the world had ignored for decades. And then, in full dress uniform, the general came to attention and raised his hand in a slow, formal salute. Ray stood there stunned, a garbage bag of his belongings still in one hand. The general held the salute and said, "Corporal Carter, my name is Thomas Whitmore. In November 1971, you carried my father, Captain Daniel Whitmore, on your back for 2 days so that he could come home to us. I was 6 years old. I have been looking for you my entire life." Witnesses said the parking lot went completely silent. Then Ray's garbage bag slipped out of his hand, and this 74-year-old man covered his face and wept, 53 years of carried weight coming down at once. He tried to say what he had believed all along, the reason he tore his own name off his jacket. He said, "I couldn't save him. I was right there, and I couldn't save him." And Eleanor Whitmore stepped forward, took both of his shaking hands in hers, the same way he had once been too humble to let her do at the bus stop, and said, "Raymond, you brought him home to me. For 53 years, I thought my husband died alone in the dark. You gave me back the truth. You did save him. You saved what mattered." The soldiers of the honor detail presented Ray with something that had been owed to him for half a century. Confirmation, signed and official, that the Silver Star recommendation had been reopened and endorsed at the general officer level, with a formal ceremony to be held at the base. But Thomas Whitmore hadn't come only with paperwork. Through a veterans housing program, an apartment in Millbrook had already been arranged, first month sorted before the convoy ever left the base. And standing there in the parking lot, Eleanor issued an order of her own, one that outranked everything else that morning. She told Raymond Carter that he was coming to Thanksgiving dinner at her house and that she would not be accepting a refusal. 3 weeks later, in a warm dining room on Chestnut Avenue, Raymond Carter sat at a family table for the first time in decades. Thomas was there with his wife and children, the grandchildren of the captain, hearing stories about a father and grandfather from the last man who ever spoke with him. There were sunflowers in a vase in the center of the table, grown from seeds off the same back fence. And when the food came out, Eleanor set a plate down in front of Ray personally. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a roll with butter. She leaned down and told him that a very wise man once taught her that a hot meal is something sacred, and that no one at her table would ever go without one again. Ray ate slowly, carefully, the way he always did. He said, "Thank you," twice. Raymond Carter gave away the only meal he had to a stranger in the rain, believing he had nothing else to offer the world. He was wrong. He had been carrying something priceless for 53 years, an answer, a truth, a family's peace, and it took one act of kindness for it to finally reach the people who needed it. He gave away his last meal, and it turned out to be the one act that brought him home. The old sergeants used to say that no soldier is ever truly left behind. Sometimes it just takes 53 years, a rainy bus stop, and a plate of meatloaf to bring them back. If you believe that no act of kindness is ever wasted, type "kindness matters" in the comments, because Ray's story proves that the smallest thing you give away can come back in ways you never imagined. And the next story, one that everyone said could never happen, is already waiting for you on your screen right now.